My name is Ufuma Abajidi from Koko in Delta State, Nigeria, and I will speak to you plainly, the way one would speak across a quiet table when the truth matters more than anything else. For 17 years, I served as what we called a prayer intercession specialist in one of the most feared covens in the Niger Delta region. That was my role, and I carried it out with discipline and precision. My assignment was not vague or symbolic, it was very specific. I monitored Christians who prayed in the early morning hours, and I deployed spiritual interference designed to neutralize their prayers before those prayers could gain any authority in the heavens. Right? I was trained from the age of 14, not casually, not gradually, but deliberately and thoroughly. I learned how to detect, how to track, and how to dismantle the prayer lives of believers. That was my work. Over time, I became responsible for keeping hundreds of Christians spiritually ineffective. And I will be honest with you. For 17 years, I was very successful at it. I understood the patterns. I understood the timing. I understood how to weaken what many people assumed was strong. But there was one category of Christian I could never touch, not once, not even close. And when I say that, I mean it in the most literal sense. These were Christians who did something very specific at 6 a.m. We studied them, we tracked them, we tried to find weaknesses, openings, delays, anything we could use. And when I tell you we tried for years, I am not exaggerating. My entire coven spent years trying to find a way around what these believers were doing at that hour. We brought in senior witches from other covens, individuals with far more experience than I had at the time. We consulted marine spirits. We held emergency councils where strategies were discussed in detail, where every angle was examined. Nothing worked, not partially, not occasionally. Nothing worked at all. That alone should tell you how serious this was. Now I am going to tell you exactly what these Christians were doing at 6 a.m. that made them completely impossible for us to curse, to monitor, or to attack in any way. And I say this carefully because by the time I am done, you will understand why the kingdom of darkness is absolutely unsettled by believers who operate at this specific hour. But before I explain what they were doing, I need to walk you through something more basic, something foundational. You need to understand why 6 a.m. matters at all. Because if you miss that, then everything else will seem like routine practice when it is anything but routine. In the kingdom of darkness, we operated according to what we call the spiritual clock. This was not symbolic language, it was a structured system. Every hour of the day had a function. Every window of time had an assignment attached to it. Between midnight and 3 a.m., that is when most covens deploy their heaviest attacks. That is when the groundwork is laid. Then, between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., we entered what we called the deep assignment hour. This is when generational patterns are reinforced and fresh assignments are released against specific targets. But 6 a.m. was different from every other hour. It stood apart. It was not just another point in the cycle. It was what we recognized as the hour of authority transfer. This was the exact moment when the spiritual jurisdiction of the night handed over to the jurisdiction of the day. If you think of it in simple terms, it is like a change in leadership. When one authority steps down and another takes over, there is always a moment where control shifts. And in that moment, the first voice that speaks, the first authority that establishes itself, determines what follows next. That is how it works. At 6 a.m., that same kind of transfer happens in the spirit realm. Whatever is declared at that moment sets the agenda for the entire day. If darkness establishes itself first, then the day leans in that direction. If a believer establishes authority first, then the day aligns differently. This is why Covens worked so intensely between midnight and 5 a.m. The goal was simple. We wanted everything positioned before 6 a.m. arrived. We wanted the curses deployed, the monitoring spirits in place, the interception agents ready. Because once that transfer happened, it became much harder to adjust anything. I remember clearly that every coven meeting I attended included a briefing about 6 a.m. It was never skipped. Our leader would say very directly that all assignments must be deployed before 6. If they were not in place by 5:45, we were to withdraw and wait for the next cycle. That instruction was not negotiable. It came from experience. There was a reason for that caution. The window between 5:45 and 6 a.m. was considered dangerous for us. If a believer happened to engage at that exact time while we were still deploying an assignment, the consequences could reverse the entire effort. And I saw that happen. There was a case where one of our members was still positioning a curse at 5:58 a.m. She was close to completing it. Then at exactly 6 a.m., the target, a businessman, woke up and began to pray. The reversal was immediate. The assignment did not just fail, it turned back with force. Within 2 weeks, the consequences unfolded in her own life. Her husband lost his job. Her son dropped out of school. She was evicted from her apartment. And all of that traced back to being just 2 minutes late. That is how precise that boundary was. But what unsettled us even more was not just the risk of reversal, it was what happened when a Christian was already active at 6 a.m., already praying, already declaring, already operating with authority. In that moment, they were not reacting, they were taking control of the transfer itself. And once that happened, there was nothing we could do for the rest of the day. Our assignments would simply fail to connect. Monitoring spirits could not locate them. Curses had no point of entry. It was as if they had stepped outside the entire system we relied on. Now, I will begin to show you the first thing these Christians were doing at 6 a.m., and I will explain it carefully so you understand why it made such a difference. Now, listen closely because what I am about to explain is simple in appearance, but it carried a level of precision that made it extremely difficult for us to counter. The first thing these Christians were doing at 6 a.m. is what I came to understand as morning blood declarations. You might assume they were just praying in a general way, but that is not what was happening. They were making very specific declarations using the blood of Jesus Christ over every area of their lives. And the difference was not just in what they said, but in how they said it and how consistently they did it. Most Christians, from what I observed over the years, would mention the blood of Jesus in passing. They would say it once or twice, almost like a routine phrase, and then move on. It was brief and it lacked detail. But the Christians, who were impossible for us to touch, did something entirely different. They were deliberate. They were thorough. They took their 10 They covered their minds with the blood. They covered their bodies with the blood. They covered their finances, their marriages, their children, their jobs, their homes, their vehicles, their food, even their sleep. Nothing was left out. They moved through every area, one by one, naming each thing specifically. And here is what made it even more difficult for us. They did not just say the words, they believed what they were saying to the point that they could see it. They spoke as if the blood was actively covering those areas, and in the spirit realm, we could actually observe it happening. When they declared the blood over their finances, we would see a covering form around everything connected to their money. When they declared it over their children, it was like a shield forming around each child. When they declared it over their homes, the entire house would light up in a way that made it inaccessible to us. Let me tell you about a woman from Sapele named Mama Eloho S. Her case stayed with me because I monitored it closely for years. She became a primary target for our coven. Her husband had a construction business that was doing well, and a rival paid us to bring it down. We approached it methodically. We introduced financial pressure. We created confusion among the workers. We caused disruptions on job sites. We interfered with contracts. And for the first 2 years, everything worked as expected. The business declined. Workers left. Opportunities were lost. Opportunities were lost. It followed the pattern we had seen many times before. Then something changed. Mama Elohor attended a conference where a minister spoke specifically about morning blood declarations at 6 a.m. The instruction was very clear. Not just to pray in the morning, but to stand at exactly 6 a.m. before doing anything else and declare the blood of Jesus over every area of life in detail. She started the very next morning. I remember that day clearly because I was on monitoring duty at 5:55 a.m. At that time. Everything was still in place. I could see the assignments operating. I could see the spirits positioned. Nothing had changed yet. Then at 6 a.m., she stood in her living room and began to speak. She started with her husband, covering him from head to toe, then moved to his decisions, his work, every contract, every project. She covered their workers, their equipment, their finances, their accounts. She named everything. As she spoke, I watched something unfold that I had not seen before at that level. A covering began to form. It started around her husband, then expanded outward. It reached the business, the workers, the contracts, the finances. Within about 15 minutes, everything connected to that family was covered. I tried to push through it. The attempt failed immediately. I tried to reposition monitoring spirits. They lost visibility. I tried to access the business through the rival who had hired us. That link was cut off. In one session, she had undone years of work. I reported it, and our coven leader came to observe personally. The next morning, the same thing happened again at 6 a.m. After watching for a while, she said something that stayed with me. She said that as long as that woman continued declaring the blood at that hour, we would not be able to touch that family. We did not stop trying right away. For 3 weeks, we attempted different strategies. We tried to discourage her. We tried to make her oversleep. We introduced disturbances early in the morning. There were interruptions in her home. Her child would wake up at inconvenient times. Even her alarm would fail, but she did not stop. If one method failed, she adjusted. If there was noise, she continued. If there was darkness, she continued. She built the habit to the point where it became part of her daily pattern. And once that pattern was established, we had no effective response. Within 6 months, the business recovered. Within a year, it expanded. Within 2 years, the rival who had initiated the attack went bankrupt. I saw this pattern repeat with others who practiced the same thing. It was consistent, it was not random. And over time, it became clear to me that the timing was just as important as the action itself. Now, let me tell you about another case that showed the same principle in a different way. There was a young man from Wari named Brother Wayan. He worked at a bank and was close to receiving a promotion. A colleague who was involved in a cult came to us to block that promotion. We introduced confusion into his work. We created mistakes in his reports. We caused tension with his supervisor. For 3 weeks, everything was progressing in our favor. His performance declined and his chances were slipping. Then something shifted. His mother began calling him every morning at 5:45. They would stay on the phone until after 6 a.m. and at exactly 6 o'clock she would begin making declarations over him. She covered him, his work, his environment, his relationships, even the meetings where decisions about his promotion would be made. She was not in the same location. He's speaking from another city, but in the spirit realm, distance did not matter. As she spoke, I could see the same kind of covering forming around him right there at his workplace. The precision of her declarations was what stood out. She named details she had never physically seen, yet those areas were being covered. Within days, our ability to monitor him was gone. The confusion we had introduced disappeared. His performance returned to normal, then improved. By the end of the month, he received a promotion. The colleague who had initiated the act, Tak, did not understand what had happened, but from my position, it was clear. The pattern was the same. At 6 a.m., with specific declarations, everything shifted. That was the first thing these Christians were doing, and it was already enough to disrupt everything we had prepared. But it did not stop there. There was a second thing they did at 6 a.m., and I will explain that next. Now I will take you a step further because what I am about to explain was even more unsettling for us than what I have already described. The second thing these Christians did at 6 a.m. is what I came to understand as commanding the gates of the morning. You need to follow me carefully here because this was not symbolic language to us. In the spirit realm, every new day has what we recognize as gates. These gates functioned as entry points. Through them, things were allowed in, and through them, things were kept out. Blessings could come through them, and so could assignments we had prepared. At 6 a.m., when the authority transfer happened, these gates were momentarily open. They were not yet assigned, they were waiting. And if no one claimed them, then the default assignment would take over. In most cases, that default was whatever the kingdom of darkness had already prepared during the night. This is why many people would start their day already at a disadvantage. Without realizing it, the gates had already been claimed before they even became aware of what was happening. But these Christians were not leaving that moment unattended. They were stepping into it deliberately. They were not just praying in a general sense, they were speaking directly to the gates. They would say that the gates of the morning must open to the blessings of God and close to every assignment of the enemy. They would call out the directions: the east, the west, the north, the south, and they would seal those gates with authority. And I will tell you plainly, when they spoke like that at 6 a.m., the gates responded. This was not imagination. We could see it. Gates that had been open to our assignments would shut. Gates that had been restricted to their progress would open. It was like watching the structure of their day being rearranged in real time. Let me tell you about a pastor from Igali named Pastor Ovi Mukoro. The situation had been under our control for years. Our coven had placed what we called a gate curse on his ministry. That meant we had stationed spirits at every gate connected to his work. The gate of growth was blocked. The gate of finances was blocked. The gate of new members was blocked. Even the gate of anointing was restricted. For 7 years, he worked hard. He preached well, he prayed and fasted. But nothing changed in a meaningful way. His church remained small, and the results never matched the effort. Then a visiting evangelist came and told him something simple but precise. He said the prayers were not the issue, but the gates had not been addressed. He instructed him to stand at 6 a.m. and command the gates directly, one by one. The next morning, Pastor Ovi followed that instruction. He stood in his room at 6 a.m. and began to speak. He commanded the gate of growth to open. He addressed every force holding it back. He spoke to the gate of finances, the gate of new members, every area connected to his ministry. I was assigned to monitor him that morning, and what I saw was something I had not witnessed before at that level. The spirits we had stationed at those gates did not just weaken, they reacted as if they were under pressure they could not withstand. Some of them were displaced immediately. When he spoke with authority, certain positions we had held for years were lost in moments. I reported it immediately. Ah, we responded by sending, we responded by sending reinforcements. We assigned stronger agents, ones that had maintained positions for decades without being removed. But every morning at 6 a.m., he was there again. And every morning, those positions were challenged again. The stronger agents held slightly longer, but not enough to maintain control. Over time, they were removed as well. We tried to interrupt his routine. We introduced fatigue so he would oversleep. One morning he did, and for a moment it seemed like we had regained ground. But his wife woke him just before 6 a.m., and he resumed immediately. We tried doubt. We placed thoughts in his mind, suggesting nothing was changing. For a short time, he hesitated, but then he continued with even more determination. He refused to stop. Within 2 weeks, everything we had established over 7 years was gone, completely gone. And once those gates were no longer under our control, the results followed quickly. The church began to grow, finances improved, people returned, opportunities opened. It was not gradual in the way you might expect. It was more like a release of what had been held back for years. And from my perspective, the cause was clear. The gates had been addressed at the right time. Now, I will also tell you what happens when those gates are not addressed, because I saw that just as clearly. There was a man named Brother S from Agabo. He was consistent in many ways. He attended church, he gave, he prayed at night, but he did not pray in the morning, and he did not engage at 6 a.m. That meant the gates of his day were never claimed by him. So we claimed them instead. We positioned influences at the gate of his finances so that money would not remain with him, at the gate of his career so opportunities would pass him by, at the gate of his marriage so small issues would grow into larger conflicts, at the gate of his health so he would experience constant weakness. And the difficult part is that he did not understand the cause. He believed he was doing everything right, and from a certain point of view, he was. But the one moment that determined the direction of his day was being left unattended. This continued for years. He sought help in different places. He fasted. He prayed more intensely. at other times, but the pattern remained because the root was still there. Eventually, someone explained to him what needed to be done. He began to stand at 6 a.m. and speak directly to the gates of his day, and the change was noticeable almost immediately. Within a short time, the tension in his home reduced. His health improved. Opportunities that had been delayed began to appear again. Things that had been blocked were no longer blocked. When I look back on that, the conclusion is simple. The difference was not effort alone, it was timing and understanding. He began to engage at the moment when it mattered most. Now, that was the second thing these Christians were doing. And as you can see, it was already enough to shift entire situations. But there was a third thing, and I will tell you honestly, that one was the most difficult for us to withstand. Now I will explain the third thing, and I will do it carefully, so you see it as clearly as I saw it. The third thing these Christians were doing at 6 a.m. is what I came to understand as the morning fire release. And I will tell you plainly, this was the most difficult for us to withstand. You need to understand what fire meant in the spirit realm from where I stood. It was not symbolic language. It was not just a figure of speech. Fire was the one element that no demonic structure could resist. There were times when prayers without authority could be delayed. There were times when declarations without understanding could be weakened. But fire was different. Fire consumed. Fire cleared. Fire left no room for negotiation. When a Christian released fire at 6 a.m. during that moment of authority transfer, it did not just act in that moment. They established what we understood as a perimeter for the entire day. It was like a boundary set in place, and anything that approached it was dealt with immediately. Think of it in simple terms. If a boundary is clearly marked and constantly active, then anything that tries to cross it will not succeed. That is how this functioned. Every assignment we attempted, every monitoring effort, every approach would meet that boundary and fail. Let me tell you about a businesswoman from Benin City named Sister Gubo. Her case is one I will not forget because I was directly involved. She owned an import business, and the competitor came to our coven with the intention of taking her clients and weakening her operations. They, we assigned 4 senior witches to the case, including myself. We applied everything we knew. We tried to interfere with her shipments. We attempted to influence her clients. We introduced instability among her employees. We targeted her finances. We followed the same structured approach that had worked many times before, but after the first week, nothing had changed, not even slightly. That was unusual. So I decided to observe her morning routine directly to understand what we were missing. What I saw changed how I understood everything. Every morning at 5:50 a.m., she would wake up, prepare herself quietly, and position herself before 6 a.m. Then at exactly 6 a.m., she began to release fire, but not in a vague or uncertain way. Most people, when they spoke about fire, did it generally. They would say it once and move on. But she was specific. She addressed every area where an assignment could exist. She spoke directly to the issues we had deployed. She mentioned her shipments, her employees, her finances, her clients. She named each area and directed fire toward it. And as she spoke, I could see the result. Each area she mentioned became surrounded by a force we could not pass through. We tried to move forward. It did not work. We tried to find another angle. The coverage adjusted. We tried to wait for a weak moment. It did not come. That boundary remained in place from 6 a.m. until the next day when she renewed it again. After 2 weeks, we had to report failure. That was not something we did lightly. The client brought in others to try again. They also failed. Someone even attempted a different method entirely and was affected badly in the process. The important thing is this: she was not aware of any of these attempts. From her perspective, she was simply maintaining her routine. And while she did that, her business remained stable and continued to grow. Now, I will tell you another case that shows how the same principle worked on a different level. There was a family from Asaba known as the Okonos. For 4 generations, there was a pattern. Every firstborn male in that family died before the age of 40. At the time I observed this case, the current firstborn, Brother Chukwumeka, was 37 years old. The pattern suggested he had very little time left. His wife, Sister Adi, had been praying about this situation for years, but without visible change. She attended services. She sought help. She remained consistent, but the pattern continued. Then she learned about engaging at 6 a.m. in a structured way. She began to combine everything at that hour. She declared the blood, she addressed the gates, and she released fire specifically against that generational pattern. She did not speak generally. She named the issue and addressed it directly. From what I observed, this created a level of at frath resistance that the existing pattern could not maintain. The structure that had carried that pattern through generations began to break. Now, over time, I came to understand something else as well. Not all Christians operated at the same level. From our perspective, we saw different categories. There were those who prayed occasionally. They were easy to approach. There were those who prayed daily, but without timing. They were somewhat stronger. There was those who prayed strategically but did not combine different types of engagement. They were more difficult. But the ones who combined all three at 6 a.m., the blood declarations, the gate commands, and the fire release, those were entirely different. In 17 years, I never saw one of them successfully attacked. Not once. And what made it even more significant was that the effect did not stop with them. It extended to those connected to them, their families, their work, their communities. All benefited from that consistent engagement. I remember a couple from Port Harcourt, Pastor and Mrs. Wanted. They had practiced this for years. When our coven was assigned to disrupt their ministry, we applied every method we had. We attempted to create division, financial pressure, personal strain, and internal conflict within their church. Nothing worked. Every morning at 6 a.m., they stood together and went through the same process. They were consistent, they were aligned, and everything we sent toward them failed before it reached them. After months of unsuccessful attempts, the assignment was called off. That was not a common outcome. But in that case, it was the only decision left. Now, I have shown you the three things as I experienced them. And before I move to the final part, I want you to stay with me because what comes next is about how all of this fits together in a practical way. Now I will bring everything together in a way that is simple and clear, because what matters is not just understanding what I have said, but knowing how it all fits into a consistent pattern you can follow. What I saw over those 17 years was not random, it was structured. The people who remained unaffected were not guessing, they were consistent and they were precise about when and how they engaged. They understood that 6 a.m. was not just another time of day, it was the moment when direction was established. When I came out of that life, the first instruction I was given was to begin a 6 a.m. routine. That instruction was not complicated, it was direct. I was told that I already understood what happened between midnight and 6 a.m., and that I should use that understanding properly. I started the very next morning and I have continued without interruption. From my perspective, the consistency matters more than anything else. It is not about intensity on one day and absence on another. It is about showing up at the same time every day and establishing direction before anything else does. If you look at everything I have explained, it comes down to three actions performed at the right time. First, there were the blood declarations, done carefully and specifically, covering every area without rushing. Second, there was the commanding of the gates, speaking directly to the openings of the day and deciding what should be allowed and what should not. Third, there was the release of fire, setting a boundary that remained active throughout the day. When these three were done together at 6 a.m., they formed what I came to recognize as a complete structure, not partial, not occasional, but complete. And from everything I observed, that structure held for the full day. But there is something else I need to tell you, and I will say it plainly. Consistency is what sustains it. I saw what happened when someone maintained it, and I also saw what happened when someone stopped. There was a woman who had followed this pattern for months. Her situation had improved in every area. Then she missed a few mornings. It seemed like a small decision at the time, but within a short period, things that had been resolved began to return. And that is when I understood clearly that this was not something done once. It was something maintained daily. The structure held for a day, and then it needed to be established again. If you think about it, in simple terms, it is like setting direction at the start of each day. If that moment is missed, something else fills that space. And once something else takes that position, the rest of the day follows accordingly. Now, I want you to consider something carefully. People invest time in many areas of their lives. They invest time in their work, in their health, in their plans. But from what I observed, very few people invested time at the moment that determined the direction of everything else. From where I stood, that was the difference. Not effort alone, but timing and consistency. I will also say this. During those 17 years, I intercepted many prayers. I blocked many efforts. I maintained assignments over long periods, but I never once successfully intercepted the prayers of someone who consistently engaged at 6 a.m. with all three elements in place. Not once. That is not something I say lightly. It is simply what I observed over time. And it is the reason I am telling you this now, in the way I am telling you. The opportunity is straightforward. It does not require anything complicated. It requires a decision about how you will begin your day. It requires showing up at that specific time and being deliberate about what you do in that moment. From everything I have seen, that one decision changes the pattern of the entire day. So when you think about tomorrow morning, think of it as a starting point. Set the time. Be there. Do not rush through it. Move through each part with attention. Cover what needs to be covered. Address what needs to be addressed. Establish what needs to be established. And then let the day follow from there. My name is Afuma Abogidi. I spent 17 years operating in darkness, observing, intersecting, and understanding patterns that many people were not aware of. But I was delivered from that life, and now I speak to you so that you understand what I once used against others. The 6 a.m. hour is an opportunity. The authority transfer is a moment you can step into. What you do at that time sets direction. So do not leave it unattended. Tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., you have the chance to begin differently. Now, let me close this in a simple and direct way. I have told you everything exactly as I saw it, without adding anything extra and without taking anything away. What you do with it is now up to you. From where I stand, the difference has always been consistency at the right time, not effort scattered across the day, but focus at the moment that sets the direction for everything else. So as you leave this, think about how you will approach tomorrow morning. Think about whether you will treat 6 a.m. like every other moment, or whether you will treat it as the point where your day is decided. If this has helped you see things more clearly, then I want you to stay connected. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because each time we speak, the goal is the same: to make things simple, clear, and useful. And if this message has meant something to you, take a moment to show your support. It helps more than you might think. and it allows this kind of message to reach others who need it as well. Thank you for watching this video.